So there's been a huge amount of focus on the question of 5G security, and in particular the role of companies like Huawei in their role in the future development of 5G in the UK. There's been a big focus on that in Britain. There's been a big focus on that across the world, and in many ways there's been sort of more sort of heat than light in relation to these issues, I think. Now we're still waiting for a final UK government decision on their approach to Huawei specifically, but we've seen in the review of the telecom supply chain that was issued by the government not so long ago, we've seen some really interesting and coherent ideas as to how to approach managing the risk that flows from having a globalised supply chain in a core part of our infrastructure, in this case the 5G telecoms networks. And of course, the big focus is on 5G, but this is a set of principles that applies much more broadly across the whole of our digital economy, where we are dependent on a supply chain that's globalised, where it's often quite hard to be clear about the source of components or to understand the standards, the security standards that have been applied. I think it's important not to catastrophize around 5G, and I think that this is an issue that, to me, is much more about engineering standards, about having the right security standards, than it is about foreign governments seeking to fix our telecommunications networks so that in some ways they can flick a switch and it'll all go dark and none of our phones will work. I think that's a somewhat exaggerated view of the world. I think that in the UK we've always been clear about the risks around that, and you have to accept that there are risks associated with how governments can manipulate technology. But the fact is that where we have seen significant attacks globally on telco infrastructure, if you like, by cyber, they come from countries that do not have a strong track record in building the technology themselves. So we won't get rid of this risk simply by banning technology from a particular country, even if that were possible, which I don't really think it is in practical terms. We've got to make the most of global supply chains, but we have to manage risk, and I think that we've seen some good principles around how we manage risk emerging in the context of 5G that apply across the board as well. Part of this is about being absolutely clear as to those areas in an infrastructure where we really do need sovereign components, or we really do need the most highly trusted technology. And then there will be probably quite small core parts of any kind of infrastructure where we want to have technology that is sovereign, that is our own, or that where we can have 100% or as near 100% as possible certainty about the security, about how those components have been built. But really, if that applies to the whole of a network or a whole of a technology, we've got big problems. So, having identified those very specific areas where we need that sort of assurance level, that really highest level of assurance, we then need to think about other broader principles, and those principles are things like designing infrastructure that has a high degree of resilience in it, so that it's not dependent on a single component or a single part of the chain, that we have resilient networks, whether that's telecommunications networks or other digital networks in other parts of industry. So resilience is critical. And we need to ensure that we have the highest standards of cybersecurity possible in developing new technology, new capabilities, whether that's 5G or whether that's other parts of the economy. And again, there's still some way to go in ensuring that we have those standards. And we need to have diverse supply chains. We can't end up being reliant on a single provider or two providers. We need to have as much diversity in our supply chain as possible. I think these risk management principles, they clearly apply to 5G, but they apply much more broadly than that. And they raise questions around how we achieve some of those things that we need, how we achieve those cybersecurity standards, how we engineer that resilience in. And they also raise questions more broadly that are in the arena of industrial strategy, really. So what sovereign industries do we need? What are those areas of technology where we absolutely have to have our own capabilities? And if we think there are some of those, how do we encourage and incentivize an industry to develop that supports and meets that need? And those are issues that are much, much broader than cybersecurity. But these are issues that are with us today. They've been highlighted a lot in the context of 5G, in some ways helpfully, in other ways I think less helpfully, but they apply across the board in this digitized, technologized IoT environment that we're living in now